When security leaders struggle to get traction, it is rarely because they have no important problems to solve, and it is more often because they cannot explain priorities in a way that decision-makers can confidently support. Organizations always have more requests than time, more risks than budget, and more competing goals than a single plan can satisfy. Defending security priorities is the skill of making the case that a specific set of actions deserves attention now, not because security is important in general, but because the evidence shows that these actions reduce meaningful risk or protect meaningful outcomes. Evidence does not mean you overwhelm people with numbers, and it does not mean you tell scary stories without facts. Evidence means you combine metrics that measure reality, narratives that explain meaning, and trade-offs that show you understand cost and constraints. This is especially important in security because success often looks like nothing happened, which can make investments feel abstract to people outside the field. For beginners, the key is to learn that prioritization is not a personal preference and not a battle of opinions. It is a reasoned argument built from what you can measure, what you can explain, and what you can accept or defer. Metrics are the first tool, and metrics in this context are numbers or indicators that help people make decisions, not just numbers that look impressive on dashboards. A good security metric is tied to an outcome that matters, like reduced exposure, faster response, fewer repeat incidents, or improved control coverage. For example, measuring how quickly critical vulnerabilities are remediated can connect directly to exposure because longer remediation windows leave more time for exploitation. Measuring how many endpoints have healthy monitoring coverage can connect to detection readiness because blind spots increase the chance of late discovery. Measuring how long it takes to triage and contain high-severity incidents can connect to impact because faster containment reduces spread and harm. Beginners sometimes assume that any metric is better than no metric, but a bad metric can mislead decisions and reward the wrong behavior. A metric that counts alerts handled may encourage rushing, while a metric that counts policies written may encourage paperwork without enforcement. The goal is to choose metrics that drive good behavior and reveal real risk posture changes. When you select metrics carefully, you give leaders something concrete to support, rather than asking them to trust your intuition. Metrics also need definitions and context to be credible, because numbers can be manipulated or misunderstood when their meaning is unclear. A metric should specify what is included and excluded, what time window it covers, and what counts as success or concern. For example, when you measure remediation time, you should clarify whether it is measured from discovery, from ticket creation, or from assignment, because those choices change interpretation. When you measure monitoring coverage, you should clarify whether you mean agent installed, agent healthy, or telemetry actually arriving, because those are different levels of readiness. Context also includes trends, because a single number in isolation can be misleading, while a trend shows whether the program is improving or drifting. It is also useful to segment metrics by criticality, because a high overall coverage percentage can hide that the most critical systems are missing. For beginners, the key lesson is that metrics should reduce uncertainty, not increase it. If a number prompts more arguments about what it means than decisions about what to do, it is not yet a good metric. Strong metrics invite action because they are clear, stable, and tied to priorities. Narratives are the second tool, and narratives matter because decision-makers do not only process numbers, they process meaning. A narrative is the story that explains why the metrics matter, what they imply about risk, and what will change if you invest in a priority. In security, a narrative often connects technical reality to business reality by explaining the path from a weakness to an outcome, like how weak identity controls can lead to account compromise, which can lead to unauthorized access, which can lead to operational disruption or data exposure. A strong narrative is not fear-based, and it does not require dramatic speculation. Instead, it is grounded in known patterns of how attacks and failures happen, and it uses the organization's own environment as context. For beginners, think of a narrative as the bridge between a metric and a decision. A metric might show that privileged account reviews are inconsistent, and the narrative explains why that matters, such as the likelihood that stale access enables misuse and the difficulty of investigating when ownership is unclear. A narrative also explains why the chosen priority is the best next step, rather than one of many possible steps. Without narrative, metrics can feel like trivia, but with narrative, metrics become guidance. Narratives become more credible when they acknowledge uncertainty and still explain why action is justified. In security, you often cannot prove that a specific attack will happen on a specific date, but you can show that conditions exist that make certain failures more likely and more damaging. A mature narrative does not say disaster is certain, but it says that if the environment has certain exposures, then the probability of harm is high enough to justify investment. It also helps to use concrete examples, such as recent internal incidents, near misses, or industry patterns that match the organization's technology stack, because examples make abstract risk feel real without requiring exaggeration. Beginners sometimes think they must choose between technical detail and business language, but strong narratives use just enough technical detail to be credible while keeping the focus on outcomes. Another key narrative element is explaining what success looks like, because leaders want to know what they will get for their investment. If a priority is improved logging, the narrative should explain how that will reduce investigation time and increase confidence in containment, rather than only saying logging is good. A narrative that defines success turns investment into a measurable promise rather than a vague hope. Trade-offs are the third tool, and they are essential because leaders know that every yes requires a no. If security asks for 10 projects at once, the response may be to fund none, because the request feels unrealistic. Defending priorities requires showing that you understand capacity limits and that you can choose. Trade-offs include budget, staff time, user friction, performance impact, and opportunity cost, meaning what other work is delayed by focusing on security. A mature security leader does not pretend controls are free, because that undermines trust. Instead, they explain the costs honestly and show why the benefits outweigh those costs for the selected priorities. For example, stronger authentication may add user friction, but the trade-off may be acceptable because it reduces account compromise risk significantly. Segmentation may require design effort and coordination, but the trade-off may be acceptable because it reduces blast radius across many threat types. For beginners, trade-offs are where security becomes a leadership discipline rather than a technical debate. If you can articulate trade-offs clearly, you can invite collaboration instead of conflict, because stakeholders feel respected and informed. Trade-offs also include sequencing choices, because sometimes the best decision is not whether to do something, but when to do it and what prerequisites must come first. A common security failure is attempting advanced capabilities before foundational ones, which leads to wasted effort and disappointment. Defending priorities with trade-offs includes explaining sequencing, such as why building an asset inventory is a prerequisite for meaningful vulnerability management, or why improving identity governance is a prerequisite for effective access control enforcement. Sequencing also helps leaders understand why certain initiatives take time, because progress may depend on other teams, other projects, or architectural changes. Another trade-off is choosing between broad coverage and deep precision, because you might choose a basic control that improves many systems modestly before investing in a complex control that improves a smaller set deeply. Beginners sometimes assume deeper is always better, but in program management, broad foundational improvements often produce more immediate risk reduction. Trade-offs also include what risks you are accepting temporarily, which should be documented and monitored, because deferring work without visibility turns into accidental acceptance. When trade-offs are explicit, priorities become defensible because they are shown as conscious choices rather than random preferences. To defend priorities well, you also need to connect metrics and narratives to decisions in a way that makes next steps obvious. A useful approach is to show a current state measurement, explain what it means in business terms, propose a specific action, and describe the expected measurable change. For example, if detection coverage is incomplete on critical systems, the action might be to improve telemetry health and alert tuning, and the expected change might be higher coverage, fewer blind spots, and faster triage. If remediation timelines are long for critical vulnerabilities, the action might be to define ownership and service levels, and the expected change might be shorter exposure windows and fewer repeat findings. The credibility comes from making the chain of reasoning visible. Beginners often think leadership conversations should avoid technical specificity, but leaders often appreciate specificity when it is tied to outcomes and presented clearly. What leaders do not appreciate is vagueness, because vague requests feel like open-ended spending. Specific proposals with measurable outcomes feel manageable, even if they require investment. This is why evidence-driven priority defense increases the chance of approval and sustained support. Another important part of evidence-driven priority defense is acknowledging what you are not doing and why. This is uncomfortable for many beginners because it feels like admitting weakness, but it is actually a sign of maturity because it shows you are making deliberate choices. If you choose to prioritize identity improvements and segmentation this quarter, you may be deferring some lower-impact monitoring enhancements or some policy refresh work. Explaining that deferral as a trade-off and tying it to risk reduction is far better than pretending you can do everything. It also helps you defend against scope creep, where new requests constantly appear and push priorities off track. When you have a clear evidence-based story for why your priorities exist, it becomes easier to evaluate new requests against that story. If the new request addresses a higher risk or a prerequisite for a current priority, it may move up. If it does not, it can be scheduled later with transparency. For beginners, this reveals an essential truth. Priorities are a living system, and evidence is what keeps that system stable under pressure. Without evidence, priorities change based on who shouts loudest. Evidence-driven defense also benefits from combining leading indicators and lagging indicators, because both matter for credibility. A leading indicator measures something that changes before outcomes fully appear, such as coverage rates, patch compliance, or training completion. A lagging indicator measures outcomes that appear after events, such as incident counts, downtime duration, or loss events. Security often relies heavily on leading indicators because the goal is prevention, but leaders sometimes want lagging indicators because they are easier to relate to. A mature approach uses both, explaining that you cannot wait for a breach to learn what needs improvement, but you can still measure operational outcomes like response time and repeat incident rates. For beginners, this helps you avoid overpromising, because you can show progress even when the ultimate outcome is avoiding a negative event. It also helps you avoid complacency, because if lagging indicators worsen, you can adjust priorities based on evidence rather than denial. This balanced measurement approach makes your program appear credible and grounded. It also helps you maintain consistent reporting, which is one of the strongest ways to build long-term trust with stakeholders. Another common beginner pitfall is treating evidence as purely quantitative, when in reality qualitative evidence can be equally important when used responsibly. Qualitative evidence includes patterns observed in incidents, recurring operational pain points, and feedback from system owners about where controls are failing. For example, if multiple investigations stall due to missing logs, that is qualitative evidence that logging strategy needs improvement. If multiple projects struggle due to unclear decision rights, that is evidence that governance needs strengthening. Qualitative evidence should still be documented and connected to decisions, because otherwise it becomes anecdotal. A strong narrative can incorporate qualitative evidence, such as describing how long it took to contain an incident due to visibility gaps, while metrics can quantify the frequency of those gaps. For beginners, this shows that evidence is not only numbers, but disciplined observation paired with transparent reasoning. The goal is not to win an argument, but to make a decision that improves security outcomes. When you combine quantitative and qualitative evidence, your priorities become more robust and harder to dismiss. To tie everything together, defending security priorities with evidence is about building a clear, trustworthy case that withstands scrutiny and supports action. Metrics provide measurable signals of risk posture and program performance, but they must be well-defined, contextual, and tied to outcomes that matter. Narratives explain what the metrics mean, how threats and failures realistically occur, and why the proposed actions will change risk in a meaningful way. Trade-offs show that you understand constraints and that your priorities are chosen deliberately, with clear sequencing and clear acceptance of what is deferred. When these three elements work together, security priorities become a shared plan rather than a security team's wish list. For a brand new learner, the most important takeaway is that security leadership is not only about knowing threats, but about persuading responsibly. Evidence lets you persuade without fear-mongering, and it helps the organization invest where it will actually reduce risk. Over time, this approach builds credibility, which makes future decisions faster and calmer, because stakeholders learn that security priorities are grounded in reality and managed with discipline.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.